And in the theatre, you'll be hearing how a remarkable British actress performs the work of an even more remarkable Irish playwright. Indeed, for many, the greatest living playwright in the world.
He was tall, he was very articulate, but also seemed rather shy. I see him best in a long overcoat, dark overcoat, I think, collar turned up, hair sort of short. But the most striking thing about him were those eyes. They were sort of light, very, very light, bluey grey, and if he spoke to you, he seemed to give you his undivided attention, and yet deep down you wondered if he saw you at all.
Samuel Beckett, as remembered by Rachel Burrows, is now in his 80th year. For over half a century now, Beckett, who was born in Ireland but has lived most of his life in France, has been writing prose, poetry and plays which deal with the fundamentals of life: pain, hope, loss and death. So great is Beckett's fame and his reputation for elusive profundity that his work has been taken over by an army of academics who pick over the bones of every sentence and write tomes on meaning and substance, all of which can be rather intimidating for the average theatre-goer. My advice to them is worry not, because as a new production of Beckett in London now proves, he can be and is accessible. Here is an evening of 3 pieces, a fragment of prose and 2 short plays, Rockaby and Footfalls, performed by Billie Whitelaw, Beckett's favourite actress, whose relationship with the playwright is unique, as you'll be hearing in a moment. But first, what of those 2 plays? Well, to put them and Beckett into context, I went to one academic who believes passionately that Beckett is a playwright for everyone, Professor James Knowlson.
Footfalls is a very simple play about a woman pacing up and down in a strip of light, hearing the mother's voice and articulating sadness, loss and distress. It's a very powerful, moving and arresting image. And that is where Beckett is most successful, I think, at creating images that actually resound in the imagination. That's the first image, the image of the woman pacing up and down. The second image is equally striking, and I think perhaps even more beautiful as a play. Rockaby has a prematurely old woman rocking herself into death. It's a lullaby. It's a rockabye baby on the treetop of an old woman. And that woman is joining her mother, who also rocked herself into death. Again, I say it as an academic or as a member of the public. It's as simple as that. Beckett is made to seem formidable. With Beckett, there is always something very simple in terms of an image. 2 tramps waiting by a tree.
Waiting for Godot.
For Godot, who never arrives. Characters in dustbins, and so on. The image is always very simple. The resonances behind the words of the text are very complex, and that, of course, is where the academic has a field day. But basically, the greatness of Beckett is that he manages to capture, I think, feelings of loss and loneliness, so that you can always sense that behind what you're seeing is this sense of the fragility of human life, the impermanence, that we're living actually on the edge, and that we can so easily topple over into a void.
James Knowlson. Well, to bring these delicate but powerful works to the stage takes a substantial actress and one who understands Beckett's work on every level. Such an actress is Billie Whitelaw, who has worked with Beckett for 20 years and for whom he specially wrote both Footfalls and Rockaby. Last year she played both works on Broadway to universal acclaim. Now she brings the evening to London. During rehearsals, I met her to talk about her relationship with Beckett. How far, for instance, when they were working on a text, did they discuss the meaning behind the words?
It never comes up, you know. Honestly, it never comes up. It's the feeling that we're both after, it seems to me. I use these words like notes. And, I was saying, I don't know what the hell it means. That is, in a way, is true, but I do feel what it means. And in this particular one, we were rehearsing this morning before you came in, Footfalls, I feel like a walking, talking, musical painting. And when he directs, he's like a painter And it's though he's sketching, and then he gets an eraser and rubs bits out so that it's just faintly there. And I feel as though he's written notes and I play them. Only once, and it was to do with this play, Footfalls, have I asked him a direct question, and I just said to him, "Am I dead?" And he thought for a bit, and he then said, "Well, let's say you're not quite there," because he wouldn't commit himself. And I thought, right, well, I understood that what he meant. And that's the only question I've ever asked him.
It sounds like an extraordinary relationship, and he sounds like a very precise director.
Oh, yes. It's, as an artist, as a painter, let us say, is painting a canvas, and he's very careful, except that Beckett only seems to work with shades of black, white and grey, shades of grey. And he creates this atmosphere and paints the picture with black, white and grey, and the notes that are sort of held longer than other notes, which has to do with vowel sounds. And sometimes he'll change, when we did Happy Days together, which is a far more accessible play, but he kept on changing an O well to an R well in some sentences, and an R yes to an O yes, because R made a different sound to O. And he was right. I mean, it drove me nuts.
It sounds to me that what you have to do is, in a sense, simply become your voice in order to do the plays.
Yes. Oh, aren't you clever? Yes. Because, in fact, I try and, I hope this doesn't sound too pretentious, I try and get rid of everything around me, like my flesh from the bones and everything, because he's written what is like a beautiful soup boiled down to an absolute lovely essence. And so I have to refine and get right down to whatever it is that makes me function. But whenever I read something of his for the first time, I always read it with a slight Irish accent. And then I find that there are certain words I cannot help but pronounce in a certain way. If he's written a word that's got 3 syllables or 2 syllables, it's because he wants those 2 syllables.
Can you give me an example?
Yes, the first 2 words of Footfalls are mother, mother. That's what she says. But it's mother, pause, mother. And the pauses are just as important as the words. Now, it isn't mother, mother. In my script, it's got bong bong. It's mother, mother. And every pause from then on and every rhythm is based on those 2 words.
Earlier on, when you described him as a painter, you said a painter who tends to use blacks and greys.
Yeah.
One does think of him and your performances with him as a kind of, in some ways, a sort of landscape of despair and pain.
Yes. And yet he's got a wicked sense of humour, you know. And in the sort of the third section of Footfalls, which does go very slowly, and the audience has to crash through, I think, a boredom threshold or a tedium threshold. But once that threshold is crashed through, it does then become hypnotic. And there's one point towards the end where, for no reason whatsoever, and I haven't bothered to ask him, except that it just seems a bit of naughtiness, he starts to tell a story about 2 totally different people. And my character is called May, pacing up and down, and suddenly I start to talk about somebody called Amy. And when I was in New York, I happened to know Liza Minnelli, and she was working in New York. She came to see this on one Sunday matinee, and she just walked into the dressing room and stood there and said, "So, who's Amy?" Grabbed a stick of lipstick and scrawled all over my dressing table mirror, "So, who's Amy?" He said, "Well, I don't think Amy's anybody in particular, except it's an anagram of May." He said, "Make that story ghostly." I said, "OK, just a ghostly story." That's just a ghostly story. OK. Well, whenever I do it, I'm very near to giggling, I have to tell you. But then, out of that, it does take a very nasty turn, and I think that's when I turn into a little pile of fuller's earth. A bit like Lot's wife, or I think I vanish.
So it's well constructed. It has the audience laughing, and then it pulls the rug from under their feet.
Yes, except that I'm sure, because I look so strange and weird, I look like a dinosaur, because I have these tattered clothes on tattered, a tangle of tatters, I say, a faint tangle of pale grey tatters. And indeed, that's what I do look like.
It's obviously, in some way, an exhausting thing to do, emotionally as well as physically.
Sometimes it can be a bit depressing.
And what about the rewards?
Well, the fact that I have this man, this remarkable man, as a colleague, and I think I can say a friend, is so astonishing to me. And if a fraction of the integrity that oozes from every pore of that man, if just a fraction of that has brushed off onto me, that's more than enough reward I could ever want.
Billie Whitelaw, who, alone on stage, enthralled the first night audience at the Riverside. Sitting with me was James Knowlson.
She's a wonderful performer of Samuel Beckett's work. She actually manages to capture all the intonations that he gives her. But that makes her sound like a talented mimic. She's a great actress who actually adds a tremendous amount to Beckett. People suppose, partly because Billie Whitelaw is always very modest about what she gives. She gives an enormous amount. She gives emotional depth, for instance, to the character she's playing. And very strikingly, in Footfalls and Rockaby, that depth of work with Beckett, either on the telephone or work in the rehearsals, comes through in a very convincing performance.
And yet, as you were saying earlier, all that comes through, but what we actually experience on stage are very powerful and yet very simple theatrical effects. The woman pacing up and down in the tunnel of light, the strange old lady rocking quietly in just a beam of light on the stage.
Yes, absolutely. You can't, as Billie Whitelaw may have said to you, and certainly other actors have said to me, you can't cheat with Beckett. And actors have been telling us for years, and academics at their peril ignore this, how musical the theatre of Samuel Beckett is. That we mustn't forget, because it's the music that stays in the mind, as well as the images.
James Knowlson talking about one of the major successes on the London stage, Billie Whitelaw playing Beckett.